not just talking about Britain, I'm talking collective we haven't done enough for the past 20 years.
Can I bring you back then to the network point that you make? Because one of the great strengths that the UK advertises, and quite rightly, is the network building effect that the Foreign Office has or has had over several generations. Do you think the 5% real terms cut in FCDO spending from 2019-20 through to 24-25 will help that network building or hinder it?
On the subject of Foreign Office budget and resources, I would always like more budget and resources. One of the things that pains me more than anything is the fact that over the years we've sold off some of our embassy buildings. I think that's a huge mistake, and I certainly don't want to see any more of that happen. And I always want to make sure that we have enough diplomats out in the field and here in London. I'm sure the Permanent Secretary will say more about this, but we are protecting the number of people in our organisation. We're not cutting the number of staff. What we are doing is we're redeploying staff into key geostrategic areas. Right, we're having more people working on economic security, more people working on information and particularly disinformation, and we're having more people working in areas like technology and fighting the technology battle.
I appreciate your point, Foreign Secretary, and I'm sure when you were Chief Secretary of the Treasury you argued against every embassy sale.
I did.
I'm glad to hear it.
I absolutely did.
I'm not even slightly surprised.
My boss at the time, Philip Hammond, didn't necessarily agree with me.
Well, that's...
I can tell you, me and the then Foreign Secretary discussed it frequently, and I was always on his side.
You can publish
there we go. I will be delighted to see the letters that you're going to publish on the back of that, because it will be fascinating to see the account of various different embassy sales. Can we focus though on this question of spending, because it's not just a question of not reducing the number of personnel. We've opted out of the European Union, and that means we've got to invest more in bilateral relationships. So that's not headcount neutral. That's actually an increase. We've got significantly greater interests in many parts of the world, as advertised by a former Foreign Secretary, in embassies including Chad. That's another increase. Where are we cutting back on the influence that we've sought to have in order to increase these posts, or are we simply trying to skin the cat a little thinner?
We're not reducing our staff numbers. What we are doing is redeploying staff.
No, I hear that, but we're increasing
areas.
Our number of posts. So we're either having fewer people in more posts, in which case we're having less effect in the posts that we've already got, or we need to be increasing the number of staff. Staying staff neutral doesn't really help.
I think Philip wanted to come in on that.
So, Chair, as the Foreign Secretary has said, we're maintaining the overall numbers in the organisation. And in terms of expanding our global network, we've opened about 10 new posts. They're actually mostly quite small, and so we can do that by kind of rearranging and including some of the headquarters staff becoming deployed overseas. So it's not that we're moving people around one bit of the network and denuding it to staff another bit of the network. We're maintaining rough stability across the network. We are looking at making sure that in the headquarters, that the efficiencies we can drive out from some of the merger activity where we had duplicate functions, and B, making sure that what we are doing is against the Foreign Secretary and the government's latest priorities, is where we've got our people.
It's worth also saying, Chairman, that we are currently working on our workforce plan for next year. So we are in the throes of finalising the workforce plan and finalising the development budget for 2022-2023. So I will be able to give you more detail on exactly where people are deployed quite soon, but we're not yet at the final point of those discussions.
Okay, can we come straight back to the Ukraine question? Because clearly one area where there's going to be enormous pressure on your resources in coming days and weeks is the support needed to countries like Poland, Hungary, Romania and so on, who are dealing with migrant numbers the like of which we haven't seen since 1945 in Europe. This is pretty striking. Can you tell us what support the UK is giving to those people in those areas and to the countries that are reliant on, that could do with assistance from us?
We a couple of weeks ago, sent out forward deployment teams to the borders in Slovakia, in Poland. We've sent out humanitarian teams as well to support the Poles. And we're one of the largest donators of aid already. So I think we've donated 294 million in aid, of which 120 is humanitarian, 100 million on the energy sector, and 74 million of fiscal support. It's also worth saying that the DEC Ukraine appeal that we launched jointly with DEC has already reached £100 million. It's probably one of the quickest raising of funding. So we've also, I mentioned Poland and Slovakia, but we've also deployed teams to Hungary, Romania and Moldova, and we've readied more than 1,000 British troops to provide further humanitarian support. And in fact, the PM is going to be announcing more humanitarian support later this afternoon. So we really are at the forefront of providing support. We're also providing consular support in all of those locations as well.
You'll be aware that other humanitarian groups are operating. What support are we able to give to ensure that people like the ICRC are able to have the access that they need in Ukraine and offer the support they need to the civilian population?
We are doing all we can to push for humanitarian corridors. The issue has been the lack of military-to-military conversations, so these humanitarian corridors have not necessarily been protected in the way that we would want. Some of those teams have been able to access Ukraine, and we are providing aid to them. I don't know, Tom, if you want to say a bit more about that.
No, that's right. And also, you in your trip to Geneva, I mean, it was very much focus of all of that. And some of the funds we talked about dispersed have been through the ICRC and others. So you're absolutely right.
Alicia, do you want to come in on this?
It's just the point on humanitarian access. In our sanctions regime, which is absolutely welcome, there is an issue in which there's no opt-out specifically for humanitarian organisations like UN 2615 that was agreed in Afghanistan. The US have passed legislation in January to make sure that our sanctions regime allows any humanitarian actor to deal with any actor that's been sanctioned, no matter how distasteful. So will we be putting in place the same opt-out for our sanctions regime?
I mean, in short, yes. I mean, I don't know the same opt-out, but actually, it's we are making sure that actually, on the back of our sanctions regime, we don't end up impacting on the humanitarian work we're going to do. It won't be exactly the same as the US system. And one of the sort of tensions is you want to get a sanctions regime through as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. You can't. So that's the tension we're trying to do. Is to get through a sanctions regime, and then you can work out general carve-outs.
So there will be a carve-out coming specifically to protect them because they don't feel they have that protection at the moment.
Specifically how we're going to do that, I'm afraid. We can get back to you on that.
That'd be great.
You write to us on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Foreign Secretary, the UK not only leads in terms of our own donations, but in terms of influencing others, I hope, to support. And the UN is saying that only about 5% of its 1.1 billion that it's asked for to support in Ukraine has been so far achieved. What are we doing to help them fill that
We
gap?
helped. I met the UN when I was in Geneva last week. We helped with their flash appeal. We will be doing more work to galvanise humanitarian support over the next few days, and in fact that is what the Prime Minister is discussing at the moment with Prime Minister Trudeau and also Rutte as well from the Netherlands.
Thank you. Chris?
How many additional visas have been given to Ukrainians since the invasion began by the UK?
I don't have the figure, but I think
It's 50.
Yeah, the Home Secretary
It's 50.
Announced that. Yeah.
Are you not ashamed by that?
Well, the Home Secretary has announced two routes. One is the family visa route, and the other is the sponsorship route. And I know the Home Office are working very hard to issue visas.
You're not ashamed that other countries are taking in tens and tens of thousands, and we, who have known longer than any of the other countries that this was going to happen and should have been preparing for it, and your department should have been preparing for it, we've only managed to give out 50 visas so far.
Well, I can assure you, Chris, that we have been preparing for it. We've been preparing for it since well before the end of last year. That's why we sent our forward deployment teams to locations in Poland, Slovakia, to provide direct support to people leaving Ukraine. Well, it's really a matter for the Home Secretary exactly how the visa process works. So I suggest
part of it's done by you, isn't it? Part of it's done by your department.
It's not.
People have to come to you. People have to come to your post to be able to get, as they did in Afghanistan, it was exactly the same issue, to get their biometric details taken.
I believe that's a Home Office responsibility that operates out of our post. It's Home Office personnel. You
have to go to your post to speak to Home Office. So you're saying it's the Home Office's fault that we've only managed to do 50. How does somebody in Ukraine at the moment get biometric details for a visa to come to the UK?
Would you like to?
So I can give one example on that. I mean, the Foreign Secretary is absolutely right. It's a Home Office responsibility, but of course, the Foreign Office fully supports that. And to give an example, so only last week we've opened up a sort of a pop-up visa application centre just on the border of the other side, the other side on the Polish border, 25 miles or so from across the border on the main road from Lviv. I think we expect the number of appointments there through that should be around sort of 6,000 a week. But that gives one example of the sort of things we're doing.
But this is run through the Home Office.
Run through the Home Office.
I think it is important to note that because
passing the buck really doesn't work as a government minister. It really doesn't.
Well,
you're all part of the same government.
I'm suggesting, absolutely, but this is the Foreign Affairs Select Committee.
Yes, and you're here as the only person speaking for the government. What I don't understand, I mean, some of us were arguing for a very long time that we should have been condemning Nord Stream 2 and getting it closed down. The British government pointedly refused to do that until remarkably recently. So it does feel as if you've been playing catch-up.
I argued for that in November last year, Chris.
Yeah, November. Some of us have been saying this for 10 years. And the British government kept on refusing to say it. So this is why some of us are a bit sceptical about this, we've been leading the world. And when you get to a situation where the UK is only... I suggest
you ask the people of Ukraine, who do see the UK as the leading supporter of Ukraine, who've been proactive in terms of supplying defensive weapons, proactive in terms of economic support, and proactive in terms of calling Russia out. And both the Prime Minister and I said that Nord Stream 2 should be stopped in November last year.
Very late in the day. But let me go back to the issue about visas. And what are the opening hours of both the post that you've just referred to and any other facilities? Are they open at the weekend since the invasion?
I don't know the opening hours, I'm afraid.
I mean, this is I said, run by the Home Office. It's a Home Office matter. And of course, we work closely with the Home Office. This is a cross-government effort.
We have posts still in Ukraine, don't we?
We don't. Our ambassador has left Ukraine because of the serious security situation.
But you don't know when people can go to the UK, but you don't know whether it's open at the weekend. You have no idea.
My understanding of the main way that people apply through the visa routes, I mean, I believe it's open continuously, but it is a service run by the Home Office in situ.
Sure. If I may add, I know the Home Office have also surged resource into all the other areas, the neighbouring states, which might also be taking, by having applicants from Ukraine. But I say the nearest one to Ukraine is the one just across the border in Poland.
My understanding is that none of them are open after 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. So at a time of international crisis, it just seems a bit of an own goal. And it feels like the UK has been... You see people in Berlin railway station standing there, offering their home to 6, 7, 8 Ukrainian refugees, and Britain didn't even have anything a new scheme in place.
We've had people, as I've said, forward deployment teams in Poland, in Slovakia for the last few weeks, helping with the humanitarian effort, helping get people through the border. And the Home Office have set up the new visa routes, which they are administering. They've also got online services. I'm sure that could ask the Home Secretary, I'm sure we can get back to you with the opening hours.
Just on other refugees, because obviously we were interested in Afghanistan as well last year, and as I understand it, there are still 12,000 Afghans who have been brought to the UK, but they're still in temporary accommodation. What plans are there for Ukrainians when they come here? Will they be will they just be in a queue behind the Afghans who are still waiting for accommodation, or is there not a plan in place?
Well, I know this is what the Home Office is working on.
But you don't know?
No.
Okay.
Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Foreign Secretary, can I take you back to the points you've made on the European security architecture? The government released over the weekend its 6-point plan for dealing with Ukraine, and always worries me when governments talk in those terms. It sounds a bit like a Lib Dem by-election leaflet. But can I press you on 3 of the points of the 6-point plan? The final 3, to prevent the creeping normalisation of Putin's behaviour, to pursue a diplomatic path to de-escalate, and then the last one caught my eye. It says, begin a rapid campaign to strengthen security and resilience in the Euro-Atlantic area. How do you plan to do that, and does it involve revisiting the fundamentals of the integrated review, which many of us now think needs to happen, and happen quickly?
This is one of the issues we were discussing at NATO foreign ministers on Friday, because the threat to European security is much graver now than it was. That's a statement of the obvious. We need to strengthen support to the eastern flank. We've already doubled our deployment to Estonia. Others are doing more. We're increasing our maritime support. We're increasing our air cover. And the discussion we had at NATO was about how can we increase that, but also how does NATO pursue greater technological reach in terms of hybrid warfare, challenging misinformation. How do we ensure that there are enough resources behind NATO? It's the point that was being made about defence spending, but there is a recognition that we need to shift up a gear.
Spending is always easy to call for, isn't it? Let's be honest. But strategy is what I'm trying to get at here. So there's NATO. You're right to talk about strengthening that.
There needs to be more deployment,
yep.
Particularly more deployment
on the eastern flank. And the GEF countries doing more. But can I ask, in terms of the integrated review, one of the things that many of us said at that time when that was published was that the UK government should pursue a comprehensive defence and security treaty with the European Union. Hasn't done that. Do you think it should now?
Well, I attended the European Union Foreign Affairs Committee alongside the Canadians and the Americans and the NATO Secretary General. And throughout this crisis, the NATO has been working very closely with the EU. The EU will be attending the next NATO meeting, and I support that close working continuing.
That's we have to be. The question I'm asking, though. Well, I'm asking about the UK government having a comprehensive defence and security treaty with the European Union. I mean, if your 6-point plan is going to become real, what does it look like?
What I'm talking about is much closer working between the EU with NATO and with broader allies, as well as us strengthening our additional relationships. So whether that's a relationship with the GEF countries, whether that's a relationship directly with the EU, we need to strengthen all of that security architecture.
So is a comprehensive treaty of the kind I'm talking about on the table? Is that part of the conversation at all?
I would say the key part of the conversation is between the EU and NATO. I think that is the important way in which this is being done. And we're seeing very rapid changes across the EU. I've talked about Germany's changes to its defence policy. We're seeing very rapid changes. But my view is the West has to be united. We all have to work together. This has been a sudden change which has shaken the whole security architecture of the West. We will need over the coming months to make sure that we have a strengthened architecture in place for the future. And the UK is an absolute core part of that. As the largest defence spender in Europe, we are a core part of making that happen.
A comprehensive treaty of the kind I'm talking about.
I wouldn't jump ahead to exactly what the structures would look like. What I'm talking about is the concept, which is countries spending more on defence, having more deployment, particularly on the eastern flank, and making sure that we are more closely aligned between all of the partners involved, including those who are not members of NATO.
The forthcoming strategic concept at NATO, how do you plan to feed into that?
Well, at the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting in Riga, I talked about the need for us to address technology developments, so quantum, AI, disinformation. I think that the UK and the US have done a lot on exposing intelligence and calling out the Russian playbook, but I think there is more we need to do. The Russians have been effective over the last 20 years in the information wars, including with their own public, who have not been told the truth about what is happening. So I think NATO needs to do more work on that front, and I think we need more hardware deployment as well. This is a wake-up call, and NATO does need to do more, and that's recognised by the Secretary General and all of the members of NATO.
And just to take you on to another area, the International Court of Justice is currently considering Ukraine's case against Russia. Can I ask if the court does order Russia to suspend its military activities in Ukraine as a provisional measure, what consequences this would have, and is there any way to enforce?
We were a key part of referring the atrocities in Ukraine to the ICC. You've seen, I think it's the largest group referral to the ICC in its history, and we will continue to pursue the Putin regime being held to account. I mean, I can't speculate about what will happen next, but we are very clear that there are serious questions to answer by Russia on what they have been, the appalling invasion into Ukraine.
In terms of the atrocities that are being that we're seeing happening in Ukraine by Russia, in your sanctions packages, are you pursuing those around the world who are a party to that, whether that's state or non-state actors around the world, without whom Russia wouldn't be able to commit some of the atrocities that we're seeing?
We are able to target anybody of strategic or economic interest to the Russian government. So certainly we're looking at all options.
Thank you, Chair.
May I just, I'll come to you in just a second. May I just pick up on this ICJ question, or rather International Criminal Court question? Do you believe that the invasion of Ukraine is a crime against peace?
I believe it's an illegal invasion.
I'm quite specific about the terms I'm using. Do you believe that it is a war of aggression?
Well, that's a matter for the ICC.
Well,
but I believe it's
not
an illegal.
No, quite specifically,
I believe
it's
an illegal invasion.
Okay, it's quite specifically not a matter for the ICC, because under treaty the ICC doesn't have the jurisdiction over that. It is, however, a matter for Russian Criminal Code Article 353. It is also a matter that was adjudicated in Nuremberg in the Tokyo trials in 1946, 1947. Do you believe that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia is a war of aggression?
Well, it's certainly an aggressive act. I'll need to look into the specific legalities of what you mentioned.
The reason it matters is because the ICC specifically does not have the capability or the capacity to investigate wars of aggression. It's not charged with it, it doesn't have it within its treaty, and therefore it can't do it. Do you believe a new international tribunal should be set up to look into whether or not this is a war of aggression, to collect evidence of it being so, and perhaps to charge, as was done before, those who began this war with the criminal conspiracy of beginning a war of aggression?
We think the best route to hold Putin to account for what he's done is through the ICC, but I'm certainly willing to look at other routes.
The ICC clearly doesn't have this capability.
No, I hear what you say, but I'm certainly willing to consider other routes.
You're willing to consider supporting an international tribunal that people like Philippe Sands and the chairs of, I think it's now over a dozen foreign affairs committees, have called for?
I'm willing to look at it, yes.
Thank you. Royston.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Foreign Secretary. I just wanted to come back a bit to what Stuart was talking about and what you said in response and had said earlier on about the defence infrastructure of the West being shattered by Russia and its act of aggression, and that we have not done enough to prevent these this invasion. And I just wonder what you mean exactly by that, because the armchair generals in my constituency, for example, think they all know what we should have done in the past and what we should do in the future. It just so happens that they've all got a different view on what we should have done in the past and what we should do in the future. But shattering the defence architecture of the West is quite some term. And are we suggesting that the West has been so weak that Putin feels that we couldn't deter any act of aggression? And if that's the case, what do you envisage we should do to prevent that in the future? Because as I understand it, when you have NATO and all of the combined might and resource of NATO, if we were talking about a military conflict, which we really hope doesn't come to it and we can prevent any more in Ukraine, that we're not impotent. We couldn't defend ourselves, and yet shattering the defence architecture of the West sounds like quite a statement.
Well, first of all, I think we have to be clear about who's at fault. Putin is the perpetrator and the aggressor here. And I think some of the commentary almost blames the West for what's happened. I don't accord with that. Putin has made a strategic mistake. He didn't understand how hard the Ukrainians would fight, and he didn't understand the level of unity and the severe sanctions that would come from the West. I think that's an important point to make. But there has been a certain amount of complacency following the ending of the Cold War, the so-called end of history, that we were living in a safe, secure neighbourhood. We didn't really have to worry that Russia had become a free market democracy and everything was fine. And our defence spending, and I mean across the wider West, our posture with respect to economic dependency, so becoming more dependent on Russia for oil and gas, ignored the bad possibilities that could happen. And I think it was a certain amount of turning a blind eye to what happened in Crimea, what happened in the Donbass region. And we're now at a stage where the failure to act more decisively earlier has meant that we now face a greater cost in acting now. But my point would be the cost in the future would be even higher. This is why we need to do everything we can to impose as tough sanctions as possible, to get as much defensive support into Ukraine as possible, to give as much support to the Ukrainian government as possible in order to stop Putin in Ukraine, which is our agreed objective.
Understood.
Andrew, you want to?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, going back to Stuart's question earlier and building on what I said in my question to begin with, surely the last thing we should be doing at this stage is to start signing new treaties with the European Union. What we should be doing is saying to the EU countries that they should be collaborating with us through NATO. So it should be the other way round. Those countries within the EU that are not in NATO should be joining NATO and contributing through the NATO system, rather than allowing the EU to become a separate security and defence organisation.
It now is.
Well, NATO is clearly extremely important and is the guarantor of security for all its members, and we have a very strong ironclad commitment to Article 5. We're seeing various countries that are members of the European Union step up their defence efforts. Frankly, it's a matter for countries how they want to step up their defence efforts. We're not a member of the European Union. We don't make those decisions for them. What I think is important is, regardless of whether countries are members of the European or not, we've all got a common interest in European security. And what is absolutely vital is that we work together on that and are not divided on that. That is why, alongside the Americans and Canadians, I attended the European Union Foreign Affairs Committee. It's why I also attended the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting. I am prepared to work with any country, any organisation that stands up for freedom and democracy and sovereignty. And we have to be relentless in our pursuit of, there are two things that deter aggressors. One is hard security. And We've talked about more deployment on the eastern flank. We've talked about the need to invest in higher tech weaponry. We've talked about cyber information warfare. And the other thing is cutting off the supply of finance to these rogue states, and not becoming economically dependent on countries that have expansionist, authoritarian attitudes and desires. That is ultimately what is going to protect us. And we have to focus a lot more on the what we want to do rather than the specific format. I'm a huge supporter of NATO. I think it has brought peace over generations, but we do need to modernise it. It does need to step up.
So I agree with everything you said, Foreign Secretary, but it was being implied earlier that because we haven't agreed a comprehensive agreement with the European Union, we're somehow at fault. And in fact, other countries in the European Union could have a long time ago participated in NATO and supported a strengthening NATO, which we all support. So it's not really our fault that we're not part of this comprehensive agreement. And frankly, we've got better things to do. We should be strengthening NATO and building up more of a global alliance rather than giving the EU a greater role, when we all know that when chips are down, the EU always left wanting when tough action needs to be taken. And it's always the United States and the United Kingdom, and particularly the Anglo-Saxon countries, that are always there to defend freedom when it's needed. And of course, Germany, Foreign Secretary, as you'll notice, have changed their policy. But about time too. They have not been contributing for a very long time. And isn't it time the rest of Europe did the same?
Someone's had their Weetabix.
Andrew, I completely agree that the UK has shown leadership on this, and this has been recognised by the Ukrainian people, and we've seen others follow our approach of supplying defensive weaponry, of supporting the Ukrainians, of training their army, of increasing our deployments into the eastern flank. But I do want to praise Germany for their change in stand, because that will have a huge impact. And I want to see others follow their lead. And I also praise the EU for moving quickly on sanctions and working with the United Kingdom, working with the United States, working with Canada and Japan to do that. And the EU were present at the G7 meeting in December. I had a one-to-one with Joseph Borrell. We agreed on the severe package of sanctions. He has done a lot to push it within the EU. So I am not precious about which organisation is pushing these measures, whether it's economic sanctions or supplying defensive weaponry. What I care about is whether it gets done. But I'm immensely proud that the UK has taken the lead in speaking out, whether it's on Nord Stream 2, whether it's on sanctions. We're now pushing for a full SWIFT ban. We're pushing for a full bank asset freeze. We're pushing for the next stage of sanctions. But we are working with our partners, because what Vladimir Putin wants is he wants a divided West. He wants us arguing amongst ourselves about Treaty X or Treaty Y. He doesn't want to see unity. And I think that is the biggest thing that has shocked Russia, that we are prepared to work with each other, and that is more important to us.
Final point of clarification, Foreign Secretary. Is it therefore, if it's unity you want, is it therefore the British government's policy to encourage the remaining EU countries that are not in NATO to join NATO as soon as possible?
Yeah.
I would like to see NATO strengthened in every possible way. And I certainly don't think it's a matter for Russia or China to decide who is in NATO. But the fact is that we need to make sure, and there are 30 members of NATO, we need to make sure that all members have to have a say in who is able to join NATO, and we need to be able to follow through on the commitment to Article 5 for those countries that join NATO. But Andrew, I completely agree with you. NATO needs to be strengthened, and that is what we are working to achieve with our friends and allies.
Can I just move on before just say put on the record praise for the Estonian government, who are now buying 60 F-35s. That's more than we've got. The Latvian government, who are increasing their defence spending to 2.5%. The Lithuanians, who are doing the same. Germany's increase is, I think I'm right in saying, about 150% of our total budget. So in total, that makes it about 3 or 4 times our full defence budget. That's a hell of a change from Ostpolitik. Bob?
A few questions on sort of related themes, if I may. The economic crime bill today, there's been some kind of bill promised since 2018. I'd love to know your opinion of the delay and why it has been so delayed for so long, and it's taken a major war to finally bring it in. And is this the end of a process and the government's going to pat itself on the back, or is it the beginning of a process where, for example, we might bring an updated Espionage Act, a foreign lobbying, a foreign agent registration act, reform of libel and data protection rules, more rules to tighten the use of harassment suits against journalists, campaigners and the like? Why have we been slow, and is this the end of a process or the start of a process?
Well, the answer is that this is not the end of the process, that we are determined to crack down on all of the practices that you talk about. In terms of the specific amendments that we're bringing to the economic crime bill, we have previously been unable to bring these measures in, but we do think, down to the severity of this crisis and the political impetus around it, we are now able to get those changes through.
Okay. It is quite concerning that it's taking a very long time to sanction these bad actors, the oligarchs close to Putin. Why have we done that when, as Chris Bryant suggested, we could just read out the names and the reasons on the floor of the House and use privilege?
I do think it's important to go back to what happened around the sanctions and anti-money laundering bill in 2018. So the government faced a number of amendments which made it harder to get sanctions agreed and made it cumbersome and slower. So in particular, the bill went through with no limits to damages available to sanctioned individuals and entities. So in 2019, we had a case where the Treasury had to pay out $100 million of public money. And the problem with that is it inherently makes the government more risk averse if they're potentially facing huge damages. Secondly, it was required there was an impact test against the Human Rights Act. And there was also the addition of an appropriateness test, including the requirement to consider significant effects of sanctions. So all of these amendments to the bill has made it harder for us to get through sanctions designation. It's taken longer for our lawyers to gather the evidence compared to international comparators like Canada or the United States or even the EU. And the reason that that is the case is that there was a group of people in the House of Lords, supported, it has to be said, by opposition parties in the House of Commons, who pushed for those amendments. So we had Lord Pannick and Lord Judge push for a more rigorous process for imposing sanctions, and particularly push for the inclusion of the appropriateness test. Lord Pannick welcomed Amendment 9 to the bill, saying it was satisfied it would impose a real discipline on ministers, putting stuff through. And I think this is important. Annalise Dodds, when the third reading of this bill went through, said that the bill gave ministers excessive power which could not be justified by the need for speed. So even after all these amendments have been added in the House of Lords, the Labour Party was still saying that the process was too fast. And she called for additional bureaucracy through a cross-Whitehall committee to scrutinise sanctions. So what we had was a group of lawyers and peers in the House of Lords who pushed for more cumbersome amendments that really put a very high bar on our lawyers being able to look at this stuff, which was supported by the Labour Party in the House of Commons. I think Chris Bryant warmly welcomed the amendments to the bill during the third reading. So we have a very cumbersome sanctions process because all of those amendments were added. We're now in a position, because of the severity of the situation, where we are in a position to get rid of a lot of those amendments that were put on the bill. So this is what we're doing. We're removing the appropriateness test, we're capping the damages on judicial review, and this will enable us to rapidly sanction anybody sanctioned by our allies. So the economic crime bill is introduced today. If Parliament passes the legislation by Monday the 14th of March, we will be able to sanction the hundreds of individuals by next Tuesday, the 15th of March. But we're only able to do that because we now have the political will to get this bill through without those amendments.
It's a shame it is still being so delayed, but let's just move on.
We started acting before Christmas. We tripled the size of our sanctions team. We brought forward secondary legislation, so we brought through on the 10th of February, we broadened our designation criteria. On the 28th of February, we brought action against banks and critical industries. On the 1st of March, we laid 2 further SIs on the central bank and the port entry ban. But my point is, Bob, that the sanctions legislation had been added to hugely in the House of Lords, making it more cumbersome. And we needed to have confidence that if we introduced primary legislation, it wouldn't just be blocked by the House of Lords. That is the issue.
So to date,
And so we brought this legislation forward as soon as we could. It's pretty soon after.
So to date, the EU has been more nimble on sanctions than the UK. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that the legislation in the EU and Canada and the US is less onerous than our legislation because we didn't have. This was put through in 2018 when we were in a minority government, and lots of extra clauses were added by Lord Panic and others in the House of Lords, supported by the Labour Party. I mean, that's the reality of the situation.
I've heard you very clearly. I'm sure others have heard you very clearly as well.
Can I just ask a couple more questions on a different subject? I'd like to get them in.
And not on a different subject now. We're going to bring in others and then come back to you if you're going on to something else. Because the question about sanctions of others, the Duma is clearly, the Duma sanctions are clearly an element that has been covered by the EU. Are we going to do that, or is that something that we can't do at the moment?
We have said we'll do that, absolutely. I just want to make a broader point, Chairman, which is what is the purpose of the sanctions? The purpose of the sanctions is to debilitate the Russian economy, so that Vladimir Putin doesn't have the money to fund his war machine. And if you look at the overall picture of what we've done relative to what the EU and the US have done, so on banks, we've sanctioned 259 billion worth of banks, compared to the US on 240 billion and the EU on 34 billion. On defence, we've sanctioned 35 billion worth. The US have sanctioned 10 billion worth. The EU haven't done any defence sanctions.
The only thing that concerns me about all of this is we called out dirty Russian money in 2018 in our Moscow's Gold Report. And this just suggests to me that that money has been swishing around quite happily for the last 4 years and maybe even collecting a bit more, while other countries may have been doing something to get rid of it. Is that true, or is it just completely by chance that we've had a lot more money and therefore we've been able to do something about it?
The point I've made is that the way we have done our sanctions work since this crisis emerged, we have hit more of the Russian economy
I
than
get
either
that,
but it's an important
Is that because
point.
more of it's sitting in London, though?
No, it's because we have targeted banks that the EU and the US haven't. We've targeted defence companies that the EU and the US haven't. So in total, we've targeted 364 billion, the US have targeted 340 billion, and the EU have targeted 124 billion. Now, I have said there's a specific issue on individuals, because of the cumbersome amendments put on the sanctions legislation in 2018, included being supported by Chris Bryant at the time. And you're on the record, Chris, for supporting
but I didn't
amendments.
say I supported the amendments to introduce the Magnitsky sanctions. I was one of the people who've been arguing for them for many, many years. What you've just read out is not in Hansard, so I hope you'll correct the record. I didn't speak in the third reading debate.
Well, I've been told you did, so I can.
Helen Goodman, Sir Alan
details.
Duncan, Joe Swinson, Sir Alan Duncan. I didn't speak in the third reading debate.
I'll get my officials to check up on that.
Mark Francois, Nigel Evans.
Carry on.
Okay.
Can I just add one other principal point here? I get the fact that you're going after major institutions, but do you accept that there are two forms of Russian foreign policy? There is the official state policy and the banks that you're going after, but also do you accept the way that oligarchs have been used informally by the Kremlin, turning economic power into political power, and they are significant players and part of the Russian regime in their own right? And specifically in this country, one of the most important roles has been to channel vast sums of money to tax havens, which they've done very successfully, guarded by the financial institutions and the lawyers who've effectively protected that caravan of vast sums of money that's been flowing from Moscow via London to those tax havens. And therefore these oligarchs, the kleptocrats, are implicitly part of the informal Russian state. Does the government accept that? Because it talks about understanding hybrid war, and I sometimes wonder if it actually understands the reality of hybrid tools.
I do accept that we need to sanction these oligarchs who are supportive of the Putin regime. And I want to do that, and I want to do that as quickly as possible. What I'm saying to you is there are impediments in place because of the way the legislation was passed in 2018. And it's only since we've had confirmation, and by the way, we haven't had confirmation from the House of Lords that they will pass the economic crime bill, but I'm assuming that given the severity of the situation, they will. It's only because we're in this situation now that we are able to pass this primary legislation. I suspect if we tried to do that a few months ago, we would not have got it through. And we certainly faced a situation in 2018 where we had these cumbersome amendments added that made our position worse than those in comparable countries. But what I would also say, Bob, is that we shouldn't overestimate the influence of the oligarchs in Russia. The fact is that Putin has operated in a fairly narrow circle, deciding on this war and to go forward with this war. He has ignored repeated warnings from others on the cost to Russia. And this is why I believe the main purpose of the sanctions is to debilitate the Russian economy. And that is why our number one objective has been to take out the financial services sector, to target the defence sector, because we think that is where the maximum impact is going to be, rather than just focusing on the oligarchs. I'm not saying the oligarchs aren't important. I'm not, if I could wave a magic wand and sanction all the oligarchs on my list tomorrow, I would do it. What I'm saying is the legislation we're now introducing will allow us to do that next week.
It's the first of other bills, including tightening up other procedures and a new Espionage Act and a new Lobbying Act that you're also going to be looking at and supporting, I hope, Foreign Minister.
Yes, although you'll be aware that those are under the auspices as well of the government departments, but we're certainly looking at all those things.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to come to Alicia and then Henry.
Fab, thank you, Chair. You mentioned there the atrocities that we're seeing on the ground. You mentioned there that we were seeing atrocities on the ground. I think we've all been horrified by the images we're starting to see, but I think the lessons of Syria is that there is evidently much worse to come. What is our plan to prevent atrocities in the next coming days, the next 48 hours, and what red lines or repercussions are there for the continued use of cluster bombs, for thermobaric weapons, and ultimately that we have to plan for chemical weapons and what our response will be to those?
Well, I fear that you are absolutely correct in assessing that because the plan is not going according to what Vladimir Putin had set out, that we are likely to see worse and worse ammunition being used and techniques. I mean, we saw the reckless attack on a nuclear power plant. We are seeing the use of cluster weapons. We are likely to see a very, very serious attack on Kiev. And that is extremely, extremely concerning. And we are calling it out. We've already asked the ICC to investigate the potential that war crimes have been committed. We're doing all we can to accelerate the provision of a humanitarian corridor, but we're looking at a barbaric prosecution of war by a dictator, and that is unfortunately the position we're in. And I think we need to be prepared for this to draw out longer term. A lot of these economic sanctions I've talked about only work over time. I think, though, that what we have seen is the Ukrainians are prepared to fight, and that even if there is success in taking the cities, even if there is success of Russia being able to occupy some or broader parts of Ukraine, the Ukrainian people are not going to give up. And ultimately, this will be a failure for Putin. But what is so horrific is this failure is going to end in so much tragedy. And not just the appalling tragedy that we're seeing visited on the Ukrainian people, the appalling tragedy for the Russian soldiers who've been sent in. And, you know, the reports of thousands of soldiers already have been killed. And this, you know, this will hit the Russian population as well.
And the difficulty is no amount of heroism survives in the face of chemical weapons use, or thermobarics or any of the others. Have we yet put in place post-chemical weapon exposure plans so we can make sure we can send in that appropriate aid? But also, will we consider, and I recognise it's unlikely to be able to confirm this today in a public setting, but meaningful repercussions, cyber strikes at the heart of Russian critical national infrastructure that are fully deniable, or actions such as that, because Putin's already declared that he sees us arming the Ukrainians as an act of war, that our sanctions are in essence. We cannot allow the Ukrainian people's bravery to be the stalwart against such weapons use. There have to be repercussions.
There will be repercussions, and you know, there's been a referral already to the International Criminal Court, and you know, it's being investigated, and there are already numerous atrocities that have been committed that are being investigated. Of course, we're doing all we can to support the Ukrainians. I'm working very, very closely with the Ministry of Defence and the Ukrainian government. In fact, on the day of the invasion, Ben Wallace and I had a call with our counterparts to coordinate how we support Ukraine, and we're working through NATO with our international allies on this.
I think my desperate ask would be that we know that no amount of threatening of legal action is going to stop him. So there must be some sort of agreement behind the scenes, secretive, whatever it needs to be, deniable, fully deniable, or actions should we see continued atrocities, particularly those nature. This takes me to a wider point, which is, for a long time I've talked about atrocity prevention with the Foreign Office not being what it should be. We've only just stood up the conflict centre, which took many months of lobbying for. Or do we have an atrocity prevention? Is it time for an atrocity prevention strategy across the whole of the Foreign Office, but also for every single post to have one, a framework that they can apply within their own post? Because otherwise we're not going to see the sort of atrocity prevention flagging early enough. We're not going to know exactly what sort of preventative and reactionary measures actually stop atrocities from going further and further and further. And this is something meaningful that global Britain could do, which is a lead on atrocity prevention around the world, but it needs institutional change within the heart of the department.
I agree with your point on atrocity prevention. What we are facing in Ukraine is, you know, a dictator whose invasion plan hasn't worked. It hasn't been as fast as he would hope to take the cities, and he is turning to more and more extreme measures. And whilst we're doing all we can to support with defensive weaponry, with humanitarian support, including some of the issues you've covered, Alicia, you know, we are not in a position where NATO is getting directly involved. That is the stark reality of the situation we're in, and it's appalling, it's unconscionable. But we have seen Putin prepared to use those types of weapons in other countries. That is the horrific reality of the situation we're dealing with.
Would be, however, and apologies, Chair, this is my last point in this question. The fact is the Foreign Office is not set up in any way to have a framework. So it essentially, when I worked on the Syria desk and the Iraq desk and the counter-terrorism desk, you were expected to suddenly become an expert in atrocity prevention when we were already so far down the line of recognising atrocities were in place that there was no meaningful way to stop them, to limit the bloodshed, to take action. We could meaningfully have, and this happens, you know, Ukraine, Xinjiang, Burma, Syria, you name it. if the Foreign Office was to use its conflict centre to create a framework and to have framework for atrocity prevention, where every post has to have an atrocity prevention strategy, where we have a core set of expertise, be it sanctions, counter-disinformation, military, humanitarian, so on, a core set of resource set in the centre of the department, we would see earlier flagging of atrocities. We would see desks not struggling to suddenly become experts in atrocity prevention, but being able to pull on a central resource, and we would end up with earlier flagging of potential atrocities and earlier stopping of them.
I think we have been flagging atrocities pretty assiduously during this campaign and collecting evidence. The issue is that Putin is pursuing these.
But this isn't about Ukraine. This is about long term, how we fundamentally change the Foreign Office internal approach to atrocities, because it has been failing time and time again, because we do not have the expertise or the resources or the frameworks in place to support people. It's too late for Ukraine, but what we could do is look at now preparing posts to be able to support for future atrocity prevention.
It's certainly something I'll look at.
Thank you.
You want to?
I can add something more, if I may, on sort of the afterwards, because you spoke earlier about accountability as well for atrocities, and we spoke clearly about the ICC, and you asked also about crime of aggression tribunals. I should also mention, linked to that, the UN Human Rights Council, where it was last week voted 32-2 to have a commission of inquiry. The other area is the OSCE, where we joined 44 other states and Ukraine to launch a mission into violations of human rights. So I thought I'd get the wider package out there as well.
Thank you. I just come back to this point about atrocities that you've highlighted, Foreign Secretary. You voted in 2011 to intervene in Libya because of the atrocities being committed there, and you voted to intervene in Syria in 2013 because of the atrocities being committed there. What's different in Ukraine?
We are doing all we can to support the Ukrainians in their valiant self-defence of Ukraine. There is no prospect, as the Defence Secretary has been clear, of NATO troops going in to Ukraine. That is the difference.
But just to be clear, the difference is the unwillingness of allies to cooperate. Otherwise, you would support it.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that we don't support it. And
it's just a straight question. What's the difference between intervening in Libya in 2011, intervening in Syria in 2013, and intervening in Ukraine in 2022? All of them have got mass human rights violations. You've already told us that there are atrocities being committed. You've already told us you're referring
there is not.
Sorry, may I finish? You're already telling us that you're referring the Russian government to the International Criminal Court because of war crimes. What is the substantive difference for your different approach to these different countries?
We don't want a situation where NATO is at war with Russia. Okay. That is the difference.
Thank you. Makes it clear. Henry.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much indeed. Foreign Secretary, thank you for being with us today. If I could take us slightly back to talk of sanctions, of course, Russia's aggression and the Putin regime war on Ukraine has been the main focus of sanctions, both from the UK and our allies, and indeed we will be developing that further. But of course, Belarus has been involved in supporting Putin. Lukashenko has been the current useful lackey of Putin in terms of allowing troops to train on his soil. In recent days, of course, we have seen a slight retrenchment on that position from Minsk, being a little bit concerned about their involvement. Not that I think we can trust what's coming out of the regime in Minsk. Can you say a little bit more about what action the United Kingdom and its allies is looking to take against the Lukashenko regime in Belarus, and how we are looking to mitigate against that sort of support that the country is seeking to provide the Kremlin?
You're right that Belarus has been aiding and abetting the Putin invasion of Ukraine, and we will be applying, we've already got sanctions on Belarus, we'll be applying more sanctions, and the measures in the economic crime bill will help us do that quicker.
And so there are specifically further targeted sanctions that are being worked on right now against Belarus.
Yes.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, talking about other countries in the region, this time not necessarily in terms of sanctions, but in terms of the threat posed to them by the Putin regime in Russia. Moldova is a country that is neutral and also has a part of its territory, Transnistria, that is effectively partially occupied by Russian troops. What support is being provided towards Moldova? And it's been said that many people's COVID lockdown projects was to learn to play an instrument or to cook better, and for Putin it was going through the Kremlin archives and seeing how he could recreate Russian imperialism. What kind of threats do we see towards countries like Moldova and indeed others if Putin isn't stopped with regard to his action in Ukraine?
Well, I fear that it wasn't a COVID project by Putin. I mean, he openly made his comments about the desire to restore wider Russia in his 2007 Munich Security Conference speech. So this has been on the cards for some time, and it's been a long-held ambition, and frankly, the West should have taken it more seriously long before. I agree with your analysis on Moldova, and it is very concerning what's happening in Transnistria and the threat that we're seeing on the Moldovan border. The UK has sent humanitarian teams to support Moldova, and we're looking at what more we can do, as are our allies across NATO. But it is a serious concern, and we're seeing that also with Kaliningrad and the threat there to the Baltic states. This invasion of Ukraine is, of course, an absolutely appalling in itself, but there are also wider security concerns and fairly immediate security concerns as well, including Moldova.
Thanks very much. Graham, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, if I may take you back, Foreign Secretary, to a couple of answers you gave earlier, and you've been admirably candid, really, about what's happened over the last 20 years, particularly about, if not dependence, the integration of the supply of fossil fuels to this country and elsewhere. The President of the United States has been talking about not purchasing any oil from Russia in the future. Do you think that's something you're considering and a real possibility of stopping to purchasing oil and gas from Russia? I know we don't purchase much directly, but there is some.
We've been very clear that we want to see more action to reduce dependence on Russian oil, gas and coal. And we're talking about the G7, about having a timetable to do that. I mean, some countries are extremely dependent, particularly on Russian gas, to very high percentages. So we don't just need a timetable, we also need to find alternative supplies for that gas, potentially from the Middle East and other parts of the world, or indeed greater investment in nuclear and renewables to be able to wean off gas. And on the oil proposition, you mentioned, Graham, we are looking at what we can do on that front, because there's no doubt that we have to cut off the supply of money into the Russian government. And the number one supply of money into the Russian government is hydrocarbons. So that has to be part of the solution. And it is why Putin has been able to fund the war machine, the army, to the extent he's been able to fund them, is because of hydrocarbon revenue. That's ultimately what it comes down to.
Doesn't appear to have funded them very well.
I mean, the invasion may not be going to according to plan, but it is causing huge devastation. I very sincerely fear that we are likely to face worse very soon.
It's going to take a long time to do that, but don't you think we should be talking to the major oil gas producers, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, even Venezuela, where there are sanctions on, to ensure that nobody is dependent on Russian gas and oil? And that surely, I mean, are any efforts being made to do that? Because it surely could be done quickly.
One of the successes of the response to the crisis so far is we have coordinated across the G7. So we can take unilateral actions as the UK, and we're prepared to take unilateral actions as the UK, but to be effective, we have to make sure that there aren't alternative markets for leakage of Russian oil, gas, coal to go into. So that's why it's more important for us to coordinate at a G7 level and more widely to reduce dependence. We also need to work with countries like South Africa, India, to reduce their dependence as well on whether it's Russian defence, Russian oil and gas, or indeed their export markets.
Again, Foreign Secretary, you've been very candid about the failures of the West in general to listen carefully to what Putin has been saying for some time about his ambitions to take back what were previously parts of the Soviet Union. There's an article in today's Daily Mail by Dominic Lawson saying that everything was there to be seen, and this is a major failure of one particular ambassador. I don't want to name him because he's one of a number. It's a failure of the Foreign Office, and it is not unique that the Foreign Office has called people who warned about Putin a Cold War warriors and didn't want to have anything to do with them. But over the last 30 years, of the big changes there have been, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Arab Spring, this war, the dreadful war that started now, the Foreign Office has been off the field of play, really. It's not managed to warn people. Do you think there is something fundamentally wrong in the way that the Foreign Office gathers information and develops policy?
Well, in this crisis, we have been at the forefront of warning about what Putin was planning.
That's 4 months, Foreign Secretary. I'm talking about a much deeper problem over a longer period of time.
I think this problem, which I have talked about during this session, is about the wider, not just the West, but the wider free world in taking its foot off the pedal on abandoning a lot of the infrastructure we had in place during the Cold War and thinking that peace would be eternal and that we could divert money onto other things. We didn't need to spend it on defence, that we didn't need an information unit, that we didn't need the same level of focus on these policy areas. I think that wasn't unique to Britain. I think that happened across Europe. I mean, we've been talking about Germany and their approach. I think it happened in the United States as well. I mean, there's a lot of famous comments around the debate in the United States. You know, focus on China. Russia is no longer the threat that we should be worried about. We should be on China. I mean, of course, if we see a weak NATO, that is likely to embolden China. So I see a tough policy on Russia and a tough policy on China as being complementary. And Mr. Chairman, I have now heard from my officials that Mr. Bryant did welcome the bill, but not the amendment. So I want to correct the record on that subject. I'm sorry, it was wrong in my notes, Mr. Bryant. I apologise.
Thank you. I just ask one final question.
I will. It was written wrong in my notes. I do apologise.
Just one final question, if I may, and it's the obverse of the question that Andrew asked you before. You said you wanted NATO to be strengthened, and that's welcome, and there are obvious countries that could join NATO. During the EU debate, I shared a platform with one of your predecessors, David Owen, and he was very clear that one of his major reasons for having changed his view on the European Union and wanted to come out of the EU, was that there was a drive within the European Union for a European army, a European force. And he thought that would mean that in any conflict there would be two centres of control. There would be NATO and a European army, and that would be disastrous in any large conflict. So in welcoming new members of to NATO, wanting people to join NATO, and we're out of the EU, but are you arguing that there shouldn't be a European army, basically?
I mean, I am reluctant to tell other countries how to run their defence policy. I think NATO is the best way of organising our collective security in Europe, and it's proven itself over time, and we now need to strengthen NATO. But we are not a member of the European Union. You know, we decide our defence policy ourselves. We work with all of our like-minded allies, including the GEF countries, including the EU, including the United States, including Australia, and AUKUS is an important part of strengthening the global security architecture as well. So we're not a member of the EU. I don't want to give EU member states advice on how to organise their defence policy. The advice I do give to them is, we need to reduce strategic dependence on Russia and take a much tougher stance. And the fact that we haven't taken a tougher stance has led to the emboldenment of Vladimir Putin.
Well, just let me ask the question a slightly different way. The two major military powers within Europe are ourselves and France. Shouldn't we be arguing strongly with both France and other colleagues in NATO to enhance that relationship? The relationship with France since we left the European Union has not been great, for obvious reasons. But shouldn't we be trying to enhance that? And that is not telling any other country how to follow their defence policy. It's just saying it's sensible for the two largest military powers in Europe to work more closely together.
We do work very closely with France, and we continue to build that relationship. As we see Germany scaling up its defence, we will also be working closely with Germany. I think that's important, but I don't see these things as exclusive. The United Kingdom has a multiplicity of defence relationships around the world, and part of what we need to do is be working more closely with the likes of India, Japan. We're negotiating a reciprocal access agreement with Japan at the moment, for example. So I think our current status enables us to be very nimble and flexible in the way we do things. And it enables us to take a lead, as we did with supplying defensive weapons to Ukraine. And we should continue to use that to impel others to act. I think that is our useful role here.
Forgive me, I'm going to come very quickly to Alicia, who's got to go in a second. So do you want to ask your question very quickly?
Thank you. It's just briefly about preventing spillover and distraction efforts on opening a second front in the Western Balkans. And I should declare I'm chair of the APPG for Bosnia, and I'm very grateful for the efforts of raising it at the NATO Ministerial and also Sir Stuart Peach. What planning and efforts are the Foreign Office currently putting in to essentially shore up the stability of Bosnia?
Well, you're very correct. It's a major concern. We had a meeting last week with the Prime Ministers of the Western Balkans, and the Prime Minister had those meetings. We're doing what we can to strengthen the institutional arrangements, including targeting those who are leading successionist movements. But what I would say, it really comes back to the point about economics. The coast has been left relatively clear in the Western Balkans for increased economic involvement by both Russia and China. What we need to do is replace that with British international investment, which we are now rolling out to the Western Balkans, and we need our allies to do more. We need the European Union and the countries within the European Union to also invest more in Western Balkans, as well as Sir Stuart Peach. Obviously, the Christian Schmidt, who has an active role as well. So we need to continue to work to strengthen the investment into the region. I think that's one of the most important ways that we can provide a bulwark to increased Russian interference.
Because I think the situation in Ukraine, the trauma that Bosnians are currently going through as they see what is happening, it reminds of the siege of Sarajevo, which started only next month, it will be the anniversary of it. When you mention the financials, there is something the UK could do now, which is that Republic of Srpska raised £350 million at the London Stock Exchange in 2021. It was the only place in the world that they were able to raise money to finance their debt. Is this something you could look at in terms of how we cut off their access to our financial capital?
Certainly. And of course, the economic crime bill provisions that we're putting through will enable us to better target the successionists in Bosnia. So yes, we are on that. And this legislation, as well as helping us make sure all the oligarchs are sanctioned in the case of Ukraine, will also help us target Belarus, and they'll also help us target successionists in Bosnia as well.
And just before I come to you, Mr. Drew, my final question about it is that Ukraine obviously demonstrates the consequences of insufficient deterrence. We know that in Bosnia, the Britsko district, which is the key point at which any conflict would be really key, we can place troops legitimately in Britsko district at the request of the federal government. Has that been considered? And if not, could I urge you to consider it? And also at the same time for us to rejoin EUFOR, because it is not a European organisation. Turkey's a member, Chile's a member, and to uplift our troops. Not just to EUFOR, but also to NATO.
I will discuss all of this with the Defence Secretary on our next meeting, which is very soon.
Fabulous. Thank you, and apologies, Mr. Drew.
No, not at all. I mean, just hearing you had to go. I have an update on the humanitarian carve-outs you asked about earlier. There was a meeting actually this morning with the various sector, including the ICRC. As I said, we want there to be a carve-out. We want the humanitarians to be able to do what they want to do. At the moment, they're telling us that the broad licence to enable humanitarian assistance that we have in the existing legislation is okay. So we're checking with them, as we checked this morning, but actually if that changes, well, we will of course do what we need to do.
Thank you. I don't think they think the CPS is going to come after them. I think they just want that clarity in law that it's completely clear.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
very
you,
much.
Chair.
Good.
Thank you, Chair. Just very quickly, I'm conscious of time. The Russian embassy here in the UK is still at full pelt, hasn't been degraded at all, I think I'm right in saying. Could you just explain why that is?
The issue is, first of all, I think it's helpful to work with our international partners on taking action on diplomats, so I think it's more effective. But secondly, we still have our embassy operation in Moscow, which does provide a way of us communicating with the Russian population, amongst other things. So we just have to be careful that any action we take is in the balance of benefit to the United Kingdom, not in the balance of benefit to Russia. But all of these potential actions are on the table and are under consideration.
And can I ask about something you said, Foreign Secretary, on the 27th of February with Sophie Rayworth on the Sunday morning programme with regards to the international brigades. You said you supported going to fight in Ukraine. And then the following morning, the Defence Secretary had to almost undo your words by saying on the Today programme that you had not been suggesting untrained people travel to Ukraine. I wondered if you could just clear up what you meant.
Well, the Defence Secretary is right. I had not been suggesting that untrained people travel to Ukraine. And in fact, our travel advice is very clear that people should not go to Ukraine. What I do say is that the Ukrainian people are fighting a just war, and we support them in doing that.
Thank you.
Chris.
Thanks very much for earlier. My memory is shocking, so sometimes I have said things which I didn't think I'd said, but I'm pretty sure I hadn't said that. And in fact, having checked, my speech on the 1st of May was remarkably good.
If you do say so yourself.
Well, nobody else is going to say it, are they? So I might as well. But actually, interestingly, on that day, there was an amendment to that bill, which was to include, which was to create a register of ownership of overseas entities, which you voted against then. But I'm glad that you'll be voting in favour of it today. Can I just ask, following on what you said earlier about sanctions, obviously it's the mixture, the social, the cultural, the sporting, the financial, the economic. Some of these are more important than others, but I'm not sure whether you're aware that the Premiership League is is very popular in Russia. The Premiership, despite calls for them to stop broadcasting it into Russia, are still doing so. Do you think it would be a good idea if they stopped?
Well, that's certainly something I'm prepared to talk to the DCMS Secretary about.
I think she's in favour of them stopping. You might as well just go for the full go on.
Well, I don't like to tread on her turf, Chris.
All right. You probably want to answer this one either then. Tier 1 visas. The government has said that it's going to publish the review into Tier 1 visas. Do you know when that's going to be?
I don't, is the answer, but I know that the Home Secretary is working very hard on this. I do think on all of these sanctions, the number one objective is debilitating the Russian economy, which is why I did point out the figures that we are targeting a greater proportion of the Russian economy. But the other objective is isolating Russia. So yes. I do think these measures are important.
Well, there might be a third reason, mightn't there, which is that most Russians aren't getting undiluted news. They're getting propaganda from the Russian state. So anything that makes them realise that things are not quite right in the world and that they are being isolated probably contributes to that. So it's good news that some of the accountancy firms have now decided, the British-based accountancy firms have now decided to pull out of Russia. I guess you would support that.
I think that is very positive.
Yeah.
It's also very positive we've seen Visa and MasterCard withdraw. I mean, we all saw the scenes on the Moscow subway when people couldn't use. I think it is very important to send a message to the people of Russia about what is happening.
Would it help if McDonald's, Pepsi and Coke did the same?
Yes.
Would you agree, however, that internet service providers should remain, for the simple reason that we need to have some form of access for the Russian people to media that is not controlled by the Putin state?
It's like my answer to Stuart. We've always got to look at the balance of interest, what is going to have the maximum impact. But yes, communication by social media. It was very interesting that younger people in Russia are much more sceptical of Putin, and that is one of the reasons is that they've been getting, until the crisis started, relatively free access through social media about what's happening, as opposed to Russian state TV, which is not an unbiased source.
Would you say Greg Barker, Lord Barker, I think he's taken a permanent leave now from the Lords, and I think he's now resigned today from EN+. Did he have any business sitting in the House of Lords when he was running basically a Deripaska front organisation?
I'm not going to comment on this specific case, which I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of, Chris, but I think it's good that people are dissociating themselves from this type of organisation, and we need to see more of it.
We've been told on the Standards Committee that there are concerns about some of the all-party parliamentary groups that are funded by other countries in terms of security concerns in the UK, and in particular in relation to some of the members of the House of Lords. Do you have any concerns about members of the House of Lords being Putin apologists?
I think there are a number of, I'm not going to go through a list of names, but I think there are a number of people in the United Kingdom who did get too close to those close to the Putin regime. And I think there has been a huge wake-up call about, and people are shocked and horrified of what has happened in Ukraine. And I welcome people getting rid of those links and dissociating themselves from the regime.
So Lubov,
but I think what I would say is that the fundamental action of the Putin regime to invade Ukraine That is not the fault of people in the United Kingdom. Yes, the entire West should have done more earlier to not become strategically dependent on Russia, particularly in oil and gas. We should have done more to build up our collective dispensers and responded earlier to Putin's aggression in Crimea and in the Donbass region. But I think we've just got to be careful about where the blame lies. The blame lies with the despotic regime. So I hope you're spending as much time taking them on as some of the people in Britain.
I've been doing this for a long time. I've been on this campaign for a very long time, trying to tackle the Putin's frequent and repeated excessive use of violence. But my anxiety has always been that we in the UK got rather too addicted to Russian money, and we kind of got infiltrated in so many different parts of British society, whether it's football clubs or political parties or whatever, and that money just became too attractive, and that's why I was always worried about tier 1 visas. But can I just ask you about some of the oligarchs? Because obviously some of them have come out and stated very clearly that they are completely opposed to the invasion of Ukraine and have begged Putin to take his tanks back home and all the rest of it. I just wonder, I think Lyubov Chenyukin has said that she's opposed to the invasion. Have you had any conversations with her?
No.
Or with her husband about it? No. Do you think he should have condemned the invasion?
I haven't spoken to anybody connected with the, how do I describe these people, any sort of Russian oligarch at all.
Have you spoken to Lebedev about it?
Since I've become Foreign Secretary. I don't think I've spoken to anybody before, but I just...
Have you spoken to Lebedev about it?
No.
Father or son?
No.
Just one. Putin once.
The people I've spoken to are Sergei Lavrov and the Russian ambassador in London. Those are the two people connected with the Putin regime I have spoken to.
As we found, the ambassador was full of lies when he came to. He said it was absolutely preposterous that anybody should even suggest that they would invade Ukraine. This was.
This is what Lavrov said. This is what Putin says, and you're right.
I think I understood you to say earlier, and if I understand the amendments the government's now tabled to the economic crime bill later on, I think they mean that you will be able to automatically sanction anybody who's already been sanctioned by the European Union or by the United States of America.
By the 15th of March.
Yeah.
So the bill has to go through. Yeah. And then we have to lay legislation to do that.
So there'll be another round of secondary legislation on the back of it?
Yes.
So, and then people like Osipov and Peskov and Sechin and Roldugin and Savalyev, they'd all be able to be sanctioned?
Well, I can't comment on the list, but I'm sure people can draw their own conclusions.
No, but the specific question I'm asking is whether it means that you then have to do another sift.
I've just answered.
Or we automatically take what the Americans and the Europeans have done.
As I say, I don't want to make it absolutely obvious who's on that list, but we are able to sanction all of the people you would want to see sanctioned by Tuesday, the 15th of March. So I know, for example, there have been proposals for a so-called naming bill that would go through the House in one day, that the only value that would add is in terms of time. There is a potential that could be done this week, although I think it's quite difficult in terms of parliamentary time. The point I'm making is everything that could be done in a naming bill could be done by Tuesday the 15th.
Right, and we'd still have the flexibility to move quickly, because all any of us have been wanting is just to go faster.
Yes.
And if the problems are that lawyers or
Mr.
whoever...
Bryant, nobody wants to go faster than me.
I do. But anyway, and just final thing, threats to Romania, because Putin has made some fairly clear threats to Romania in the last 24 hours. How would we respond to that?
There have been threats made to Romania, to the Baltic states, and this is why we absolutely need to strengthen the eastern flank. What? So we're sending troops to Romania? I mean, what Putin has said is basically anybody who's sent. So as I understand it, the proposal is that some planes will be going from one country to another country and then backfilling straight into. I really, really can't comment on that.
Okay.
We've got a few quick things to hit on. We're going to start with Royston.
Thank you. Foreign Secretary, one of the countries, and of course Mr. Drew knows more about this than most, that didn't support us in the UN and have met Putin. In fact, on the day of the invasion, I think Imran Khan met President Putin and have agreed to buy oil and grain and such like from Russia, and weren't particularly helpful when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, in my opinion, either. What are we going to do about continuing to send significant aid packages to countries like Pakistan that are not joining the alliance against Putin?
On the subject of aid, we are currently working on the aid budget for next year. So that will be the 2022-2023 aid budget. We're also working on our international development strategy. And our strategy, first of all, is moving much more money from multilateral organisations into bilateral aid, so we have much more control about where we're spending the money. And it will be much more geopolitically focused. So we will be focused on funding areas where it's going to lead to a more positive outcome for freedom and democracy in the future. So that is the lens at which we will be looking at our aid money through, alongside restoring the funding on humanitarian aid and restoring the funding on women and girls. So I can't make comments about specific money for specific countries because we're still working on that, but we will be looking at the incentives that countries have to work in a positive direction for freedom and democracy when we're looking at the aid budget.
Understood. But do you think that it's acceptable to be sending significant aid to countries that are not joining this coalition against a barbaric invasion?
I think we need to look at both the carrot and the stick. So one of the things I said earlier is there are a lot of countries who are dependent on Russia, whether it's for the supply of oil and gas, whether it's exports, whether it's defence support. So we need to provide them with alternatives. And by that, I mean the sort of broader Western alliance. But I agree with you that we also need to look at the stick in terms of what we do when countries don't respond and are prepared to vote with a barbaric regime.
Thanks very much. Stuart.
Thank you, Chair. Secretary, thanks for your time this afternoon. It's been illuminating. But can I finish with a suggestion and a question? On disinformation, I've wanted us to take disinformation, particularly hostile foreign disinformation, much more seriously than we have. And last year I published a whole report on this with 9 recommendations. But there's one that I'd like to ask you about that I asked your predecessor about. And that is in relation to Parliament and the public at large understanding the threat and the nature of hostile disinformation. And one of the suggestions I made was that we could have a, say, 6-monthly written statement to Parliament from your department outlining, in as much as it can, what the threat looks like, how it's changing, how it's emerging. Because I think we need to do better at building up the resilience to the threat as it evolves. To move away from that to my question, what is your assessment of Israeli, Turkish and French efforts in terms of their discussions with the Putin regime in trying to find some kind of de-escalation route?
So on disinformation, I like your idea.
Good.
So I will...
sending you the report.
I will follow up on that. I mean, my view is that while Putin is conducting an abhorrent war in Ukraine and hasn't withdrawn his troops, is carpet bombing or shelling towns and cities, I don't believe he is serious about talks or diplomacy. I simply don't believe he's serious.
I'm afraid I agree with you, but there we go.
Thank you very much, Andrew and then Henry.
Very quick question, Foreign Secretary. In times of global instability and potential conflict, I'm sure you'd agree with me that that's the point when we most value our global Britain assets around the world. So do you agree with me that the strategic importance of the overseas territories at this point comes into play, particularly the British Indian Ocean Territory, Gibraltar, and also Akrotiri and Deucalion? And will you guarantee that the sovereignty of all those places, as British, remains rock solid under your stewardship as Foreign Secretary?
I completely agree with you. They are all very, very important. I'm currently working on finalising the negotiations with the EU on the subject of the Gibraltar arrangements post-Brexit, and we're also working to support our efforts in BIOT, where we are very confirmed as to our sovereignty.
Thank you.
Can I just build on that and say I'm sure we all agree with Andrew and the importance of the overseas territories and praise some jurisdictions like the BVI who've done a huge amount for openness. Will you be introducing the various ideas that have been suggested by members of this House, including people like Margaret Hod and Andrew Mitchell, to ensure that the openness of registers that we're going to be introducing here will also apply to those jurisdictions over which we exercise influence?
The individual sanctions that we're putting in will automatically apply.
But it's not sanctions, this is also the openness of registers for sort of corporate ownership and so on.
Yes, and we are holding an extraordinary Privy Council with the overseas territories to talk about all of those ideas and get those implemented.
Thank you. Henry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to hear your comments with regard to the British Indian Ocean Territory a few moments ago. And
Lord Ahmed has recently visited to confirm this as well.
Yeah,
visited Mauritius.
Very good. And I will be looking to seek further information on that in a future session. But coming back to Russia and Ukraine, you've rightly spoken about the importance of the information unit. It seems from recent reports that even some really quite senior people in the security apparatus of the Russian state were unaware of, or claimed to have been unaware of, Putin's full plans for Ukraine. What is the assessment of the British government with regard to the unity at senior levels within the intelligence, military and foreign service elements of the Russian government?
I think it's fair to say we don't think there's much room for dissent or for voicing an alternative opinion in the Russian government. So I think it's fair to say not much information may have gone to President Putin.
May I just close with some questions about... Oh, sorry. Do you want to... Are you going to be very quick? Go on.
I am going to be very quick. You've been very clear about our Article 5 obligations, Foreign Secretary. Also clear that in terms of not agreeing to enforce a no-fly zone that we don't want, we'll get involved with a direct conflict with Russia. But are there any intermediate situations that could give rise to a conflict with Russia? And I'm thinking really about the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which puts an obligation for national state parties to act. Do you think that could lead to a direct conflict?
I think it's important that we look to avoid a direct conflict with Russia. I think it's in nobody's interests that happens. That's why we are clear that the no-fly zone would be extremely problematic from that point of view. And what we need to do is pursue these actions through the International Criminal Court, as well as working on the ground to protect the humanitarian corridors.
Thank you. May I just ask some very brief questions to close off with China? How do you think China is viewing the events in Ukraine?
So I had a discussion with Wang Yi, my Chinese counterpart, ahead of the Security Council meeting, and made it very clear that any country who believes in sovereignty, and the Chinese were clear that they believed in the sovereignty of Ukraine, and in fact they subsequently put out a statement, could not possibly support Russia at the UN Security Council. In fact, they didn't vote with Russia, which was significant. Russia has become a global pariah. It's been cut off from modern technology. its banks have been cut off, the central bank has been cut off. And I believe that China does not want to associate too closely with that. And it's important that we are very clear that China's associations with that would be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Having said that, there's also the issue of the importance of showing strength as NATO, because the rest of the world will be watching, including China, on how the West continues to respond. This is why the UK is pushing tougher sanctions, including on all of SWIFT, including a timetable to reduce dependency on oil and gas, and also continuing to supply defensive weapons to Ukraine, despite what has been said. Because I think it's very important at this stage we do not resile from our position. So, with respect to China, we need to continue to work to reduce strategic dependency on China. We need to be aware of the broader need to maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. And we need to be very, very clear with China, which I was in my call with Wang Yi, that any association with this invasion of Ukraine, is a violation of the principles that they purport to believe in, of the maintenance of sovereignty of nations.
May I just push on what Wang Yi said to you? Did the Chinese foreign minister express any greater support of the Russian case, or did he express any views on Russian energy transfers to the east?
He didn't express any views on Russian energy transfers, and there are some logistical problems for Russia. The relevant pipeline has not been built, is my understanding, so it's actually quite difficult for Russia to be able to transfer the energy that they're selling to Europe to China. You'll have seen the public statement of Putin and Xi before the Beijing Games, and you've seen the public statements that China have made on NATO, and for the first time China has sort of been talking about who should and shouldn't be a member of NATO, which is clearly not a matter for them. But I do think China don't want to associate themselves with what has happened in Ukraine, because I think they realise the strategic implications, and that's very, very much the message I got from my call.
May I ask?
Which I'll be following up.
Thank you. Have you done any assessment on the implications of $130 oil for an energy consumer like China?
I'm sure Kwasi Kwarteng is working on that as we speak, and I know Kwasi is meeting G7 energy ministers this week to talk about how we work together on this.
Presumably Caroline Wilson's team in Beijing will be looking at the impacts on the Chinese economy of massive oil price hikes, which can't be good for an oil-consuming nation like China.
True.
What assessment have you done for the likely logistical failure of Russian military adventures in Syria, Mali and Libya?
Well, we continue to examine what is happening and how we are seeing a Russian defence force that is very thinly stretched. I don't know, Tom, if you want to say.
I think I can say though that the Russia-Ukraine crisis is the business of the whole of FCDO now. So you look at all our posts around the world, whether it's in the Middle East or whether it's in China, and actually the core of their reporting, their analysis. So I don't know the specifics of the energy analysis in China, but that's what all our people are doing because of the importance of the issue.
Because clearly, if the logistics in Syria are as tight as those in Ukraine appear to be, and they must be more complex because they're either shipping through Turkish waters or they're airlifted over Turkey, then this could lead to a very severe change in governance in Damascus.
And actually, not as you say, not just in Syria. There are other places where there are Russian military adventures, which we also worry about. So yes, you're right.
I'm just looking at the migrant flows from Libya and Mali and Syria in the last few years and seeing how they could change the implications for Southern Europe. Well, I'll be delighted to hear if you have any views on it in due course. We shall write to you on it. Thank you. Foreign Secretary, look, thank you very much for doing this session on Ukraine. As I say, it's been 7 months that you've been in post, and while it's fantastic to see you on the 6 months...
You say several months?
I said 7, isn't it? 7? Is
no,
it 6?
I think it's less than 6.
6. You came in September, didn't you? Yeah, what was that? 5 and a bit, 6. We'd be very grateful to see you in the next month, because clearly, although Ukraine is all dominant at the moment, the world is changing very quickly, and the way in which you shape the Foreign Office in the coming years, one hopes, will be interesting and of great importance to this committee and to the House. Thank you.
Thank you.
Order, order.
The proceeding has ended.